So I'm pleased now to be joined by Yossi Kuperwasser. He is the director of the project on regional Middle East developments at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. He's one of the foremost Israeli security experts, and so it's great to have you, Yossi.
Great to have you. Good to be with you.
We have to let's go straight to the big issue, which is Iran, and now even American generals are saying that Iran is very close to acquiring nuclear capability. How do you see the situation right now?
Well, I think the situation is becoming more and more dire. As the Iranians make progress towards being a threshold country, namely a country that can, within a very short period of time, produce a nuclear device, nuclear explosive device, or even a nuclear weapon. And the Iranians are already having showed that they are capable of enriching uranium to 60%, and they've already accumulated more than 17 kilograms of uranium enriched to that level, which is quite a considerable amount. And they are continuing to accumulate uranium that is enriched to 20%. More than 113 kilograms of that kind of uranium is also already at their disposal. And they have more than 2.5 tons of uranium enriched to 3.67% and above, up to 4.5%. Most of it is 4.5%, which altogether enables them to produce, if enriched to a level of 90%, something like at least 3 bombs, the amount needed for 3 bombs or 3 explosive devices.
And how long will that breakout time be, according to your estimates?
So there are 2 stages here. First of all, the stage that would lead them to having uranium enriched to 90%, which is the military level, that they probably need in order to build bombs of the small size that they are planning to have, that would be able to be mounted on either the BM-25 or the more reasonably the Shahab-3 missiles that they are producing. So this stage can take only, for the first device, only a couple of weeks. And for a second device, a couple of months. And, that's not a long time.
Sure.
Now there's another stage, which is the time that they might need, and the definition of threshold state would apply to them once they have the 90% enriched uranium. But what they can do partly simultaneously and partly after they do that is they have to master the technology that is needed in order to turn this enriched uranium into a bomb. And this may take them some time. There's a big question mark about how much time. Some people say it's going to take them like 2 years. I'm much less optimistic. I think much of the work that they should do in this stage is already done or is being done as we speak. We saw, for example, one of the major issues that they have to do is to turn this enriched uranium into uranium metal. And we saw that they've started already doing that with uranium enriched to 20%, but it's not much different than doing it with the uranium enriched to 90%. They already have the capability and the know-how of doing that. And we know that they have done quite a lot of progress in their tests of detonators back in 2003. So they know something about using the proper detonators. And I'm sure that whatever can be done in parallel, simultaneously to developing producing the enriched uranium, they are already doing it. Because they need to shorten as much as possible the time needed between having the 90% enriched uranium and having a nuclear explosive device. So I think it's going to be, it may be less than 2 years. Of course, if they encounter all kinds of difficulties and they try to do something and they don't manage to master this technology, that's going to take them some more time. And cannot. They have to take this into account, but we have to take into account the possibility that everything is going to succeed and they will just smoothly move towards having the weapon.
Yeah. So is there a solution for, like, seen from Israel's perspective? What is the best solution scenario according to your view?
Well, we think that what should be done is to put pressure on the Iranians and to convince them to go for an agreement that is much better than the original one. An agreement that does provide the IAEA with the capability to inspect anytime, anywhere, and not only in declared sites, and in a way that allows the Iranians to escape actually real inspection. We think that there should be an inspection that enables the IAEA also to keep track of what the scientists are doing, and not only of sites, because the know-how is in the heads of the scientists, and they can move wherever they want to areas that are undeclared, and we have to find a solution to that. We think that there shouldn't be those sunset clauses in the agreement, and that Iran should commit to not having a nuclear weapon forever. And we think that an agreement should take care of the missiles as well, and not only of the enrichment. And we think that Iran should give up the infrastructure that some of the infrastructure they have. For example, the Fordow facility that is 60 meters deep into a mountain, and this is a very small facility, only constructed for the purposes of military production, uranium production for military purposes. And we think this should be taken care of. And we think that an agreement should also take care of the Iranian regional activities that are very problematic and promote terrorism and instability all over the Middle East. All those issues should be in the agreement. That's what we think. And this is not going to happen without some pressure on the Iranians, because they're not going to volunteer. This is the core raison d'etre of this regime. So it's going to be very difficult to convince them to go through all these concessions. But it's necessary in order to make sure that Iran is not becoming a nuclear state. Now, this pressure should be made of economic pressure, and some sort of isolation, and of course some credible military option that exists, but is not referred to too often. You mentioned that the Americans are now trying to make the impression that they do have it. I mean, everybody knows they have it, but people are not convinced that they are seriously considering using it if the Iranians don't stop and keep moving towards having the capability to produce nuclear weapons. And that's the difficult part on behalf of the Americans, because it's very difficult to convince the Iranians that the Americans really mean it, when whatever the Iranians are doing, the Americans are keeping silent and do not react in any way. They were watching all the steps that the Iranians took on the nuclear field, and they had no reaction. On top of that, it's not only about the JCPOA, it's also about the NPT. The Iranians are breaching the NPT in a very profound manner. They don't provide any information about those sites that the IAEA is trying to learn about. What was the reason for the Iranians having their, in Toghuzabad, in Abadeh, why did they have all kinds of uranium anthropogenic particles? And there was no way to get an answer from the Iranians, and still the Americans did nothing. And they were attacked by the Iranians in Tanf, and nothing was done. They probably were standing behind the attack on Kadhimi, the Prime Minister of Iraq. Nothing was done. So it's very difficult for the Americans now to deliver a message that they can do something.
Yeah. So if we wake up one morning here in Norway and the news is that several sites in Iran has been bombed, and after a while it's clear that it is done by Israeli forces. Try to explain to us as simple as you can, like for a person in Norway who's not much into security and strategic policy, what would be the reason for the Israeli government taking this difficult decision, if in any future event it will happen? Why? If a friend of Israel in Norway should explain to his friends why Israel had to do this, what is the answer?
First of all, I hope we shall not get there. But,
sure.
But if we get to the point where we have to take care of the Iranian nuclear program, it's because we understand what is the purpose of this program. And that's why we say that Iran should not have the capability to produce nuclear weapons, because the Iranians clearly want to use this nuclear capability that they are trying to achieve in order to promote their mission of exporting the revolution, the radical Islamic revolution in the Iranian version, to the region and beyond. And one of the major targets they keep looking at is Israel. They say Israel should be eradicated from the map. And of course, this kind of capabilities in the hands of such a regime constitutes a clear and present danger for the existence of the state of Israel. That's why we cannot tolerate a situation like that, and we might have to do something. Of course, we don't have to do it in the manner that you were talking about, other ways.
Sure.
And we can do all kinds of clandestine activities, we can do all kinds of cyber activities, we can do all kinds of kinetic activities as well. Yeah. But if necessary, and I hope we should not get there, because basically I'd say that this is a threat for not only for Israel. This is a major threat for Israel. It may turn to be an existential threat for Israel. And that's why if your friends in Norway wake up and see something like that, they should understand that we took the measures necessary in order to avoid an existential threat for Israel. But the threat is for the entire world. The Iranian mission is not only Israel. The Iranian regime's message and the mission goes well beyond Israel. And that's why we think that the international community doesn't say that it's not their problem. They say it's our problem, but we want to reach a diplomatic solution. It's, I mean, we've tried to reach a diplomatic solution and it didn't work. That's where we are right now. And that's why I think that if we don't reach a diplomatic solution that is a satisfactory solution, not a diplomatic solution that allows Iran legitimately move forward with their nuclear program to the point where in 10 years they can actually produce without any problems and with a lot of money in their coffers and without any threat to their security, and they would be able to produce in 10 years a big arsenal of nuclear weapons, like 100 nuclear weapons. Yeah. That's what's going to happen if we just go back to the agreement, be it in the version that the Iranians want or in the version that the Americans want. Any of these versions would guarantee Iran the capability to produce nuclear weapons, mass amount of nuclear weapons in 10 years. That is very dangerous, and we should not let that happen. So that's why we say that if such an agreement is reached, we shall not have to abide by it, because we have to take care of our security and our existence, our survival. And we have this experience, you know, that when we hear somebody say that they want to terminate us, they occasionally mean it. And we cannot play around with this kind of threat, and that's why we have to make sure that they don't have the capability to produce nuclear weapons. By the way, in the last communique, joint communique that the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany issued, they also, for the first time, used this language that we are using, that Iran should not be able to, or we want to make sure that Iran cannot produce nuclear weapons. It's not only that they cannot have one, but they cannot have the capability to produce one. Yeah. That's the most important thing, because you cannot rely on the Iranian goodwill and wait for the last moment to see if they actually use their capability in order to have nuclear weapons. You wait for this last moment, it's going to be too late. So that's why we have to act early on to make sure that they don't have the capability. And they are very close to having this capability, I would say.
Yeah. And talk to us a little bit about how nuclear Iran will embolden the Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, and
of course, this is well, there are two stages here. First of all, if we reach an agreement, this means that Iran, that even now under the economic pressure, spends so much money on promoting its proxies around the region, will have ample amount of money to support them even more so, and we shall see considerable strengthening of the capabilities of Hezbollah, of the Houthis in Yemen, of the pro-Iran militias in Iraq and so on and so forth, and of course the forces that align with Iran in Syria. So this is one thing that we shall see. Moreover, I would say this would be seen as a big victory of Iran over the United States and the West, and this will make it easier for the Iranians to mobilize and recruit more people in Baluchistan, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, wherever, and use them as soldiers of the Iranian revolution, Islamic revolution, and of course also in Saudi Arabia and in other states in the region. Their capability to have an impact on the stability of these countries is going to grow considerably, because they would prove that they were able to overcome the pressures of the West and force their opinion and positions over the West. This is very dangerous. This is in stage one. In stage two, if they manage to translate all of that also to having a nuclear weapon, either on the track of through the track of the agreement or through the track of what they're doing right now, moving without an agreement towards having a nuclear weapon, this is going to embolden the entire group of organizations and countries that are friends of Iran, and they are going to be much more ready to take action, because they would feel that they have some sort of nuclear deterrence and nuclear capability supporting them. And whereas Hezbollah, for example, today in Lebanon, is quite cautious because of a variety of reasons, not only because of that reason, but amongst other reasons also because of the feeling that Iran is still waiting to become a nuclear weapon nuclear country. Once the Iranians have it, the carefulness and the resentment of Hezbollah to act in all kinds of situations is going to be much lesser. And we have to take this into account. It's not only about them. It's going to affect the situation in Iraq. I think the Hashd al-Sha'bi is going to be popular mobilization units are going to be much more trigger happy. Yeah. And so is the case with the Houthis and others that are going to know that they can rely on the Iranian support. So I think that this is going to affect the entire Middle East. On top of that is also the question of the arms race, the nuclear arms race. Once the Iranians are going to have it, everybody else will feel that they need to have one too, to balance the threat and to mitigate the threat from coming from Iran. So we shall see a lot of Middle Eastern countries trying to get hold of an Iranian weapon, of a nuclear weapon, be it Saudi Arabia or Egypt or Turkey or Algeria or whatever. That's quite a long list of candidates. Yeah. So this is going to again affect the situation in the Middle East, and that is a volatile and dangerous place anyhow, but it's going to be even much more dangerous. Yeah.
Then I also want to ask you about the situation in Iraq, but what you said there in the end open up for the question from critics of Israel: why should Israel be allowed to have nuclear weapons and Iran not? What is your answer to that?
Israel has always said it's not going to be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East.
Yeah,
and we keep to our promise, and we never did. And besides, nobody thinks that even if Israel would have nuclear capability, nobody thinks that Israel is going to use it in order to threaten its enemies. It's, for Israel, having the capability to protect itself against strategic and existential threats is something that makes sense, because there are so many elements in the Middle East that want to see us disappear. Yeah. Nobody wants to make the state of Iran disappear, and nobody is threatening the Iranians. They do what they do in order to support their idea of spreading their ideology over the Middle East, and to make it possible, they need this capability. Maybe somewhere back in the 80s, they thought about it as a balancing act to the capabilities of Iraq, but this was a long time ago, and it's not the case anymore.
So in Lebanon,
see, my phone is broken.
No problem.
Now I cannot stop it. Okay.
So in Lebanon, obviously, Iran has a huge influence. I'm not that familiar with the development in Iraq, but how do you estimate the influence of Iran in Iraq? Is it like more or less as close as in Lebanon, or how is that?
There are many similarities. In both places. Iran has a Shiite population that it is in close touch with, and it has a militia that is the strongest power in the country that is not non-governmental. There's also the Lebanese armed forces. You have the Iraqi armed forces, but both of them are not in any way ready to confront the militias that are supported by Iran. In both cases, they actually cooperate with them to some extent, and this is the similarity. In both places, there are also some parts of the Shiite populations that are not that willing to give up their local identity, the Iraqi identity or the Lebanese identity, just because the Iranians demand so. So we see Muqtada Sadr now in Iraq, and we see Nabi Berri's forces, the Amal forces in Lebanon, that are a little bit different than Hezbollah, and of course a little bit different than the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq. What's interesting is that in both places, the people, including some of the Shiites, feel that they don't want to be subordinated to Iran, and the Iranians have to fight strong and hard, to force their opinion over the country. And they face many difficulties because they are seen as those who bring with them many problems and difficulties for the country, be it in Lebanon or in Iraq. So there's a popular movements that are going against the Iranian rule. And so what happened in Iraq specifically was that the forces that are identified with Iran suffered a very severe blow in the last elections. And much of the tension there is because they find it very difficult to accept their defeat. And they go to the streets and shoot at all kinds of places, and maybe tried even to kill the Prime Minister Kazemi. So this is a source of instability and the show of the Iranian force and problems at the same time. But none of these countries, neither Iraq nor Lebanon, are in a position to get rid of the Iraqi control over what's going on, and I would say influence about what's going on in those two countries. And this is a very, very big challenge for the governments in both places. And as a matter of fact, they sort of try to maneuver without confronting Iran to limit their influence. Doesn't work so well. And, in none of these places doesn't work so well. And we shall see how it happens. In both cases, you have, on the other side, you have Sunni Arab population that doesn't want to work with Iran. And you have some third party that is more problematic for the Iranians, the Christians in Lebanon and the Kurds in Iraq. Amongst which you have some people that are ready to cooperate with Iran, but also there are some people who do not want to cooperate with Iran. It's the complexities of those two societies that show up under the Iranian pressure. But from the Iranian point of view, they believe that eventually, definitely, if they get the money that they are expecting to gain, or if they get the nuclear weapon, they will be in a much better position to have more influence on what's going on both in Iraq and in Lebanon. And they believe that this may be around the corner because they're in a position to get what they want. They believe so from the international community, especially from the United States.
Yeah. After a short break, we will be back with Yossi Kuperwasser when we talk about lessons that we could learn from Afghanistan, and we should also talk a bit about the Palestinians and Palestinian NGOs being designated by Israel as terrorist organizations.
My name is Finnur Thorlacius Eriksson, and I became a member of MIF because I became aware that Israel was being misrepresented in the Icelandic media and the Western media in general. And I wanted to change that. I wanted to counter that. And MIF seemed like the right venue to do so. When I came to MIF's conference in Kristiansand, I experienced a lot of warm people who seem to be willing to do their part in advocating for Israel and seeing the discussion change about Israel in the West. The members of MIF seem to be very enthusiastic, happy people who are willing to make a change and dare to stand up for what they believe is right. MIF is for every person who believes that there is a media bias against Israel in the West, who believes Israel is a force for good in the Middle East and the world, and who wants to contribute to making that fact known. So anyone who, no matter on the political spectrum, where on the political spectrum they are, they can join MIF and take part.
So we are back now with Yossi Kuperwasser, it's almost forgotten now that that the US and Norway and many other countries left Afghanistan a few months ago, and maybe if we forget this quickly, we will not learn the lessons. And what lessons do you think Europe and the Western countries should learn?
Well, first of all, I think that the first lesson is that you should well define your goals when you go on a military mission. Yeah. If you leave it vague, it's very difficult to know when you accomplish your goal and what are you going to do next. And there was some ambiguity about what was the purpose of this war. And the name that was given to it was as a part of the war on terror. Yeah. Terror is not an enemy by itself. Terror. The enemy are those who perform terrorism, that perpetrate terrorism. This is the enemy, and we know that the enemy in this case was the groups that are radical Islamists that use terrorism as a tool for promoting their interests. And this is not only Al-Qaeda, that was the immediate perpetrator of the 9/11 attacks that brought the Americans and the international community to Afghanistan, but wide array of groups that operate in many places and in Afghanistan amongst them. So ISIS, for example, is quite present in Afghanistan. Of course, Al-Qaeda. The fact that bin Laden was killed, not in Afghanistan, doesn't make the war over, doesn't bring the war over. The war is going on. And unfortunately, by doing what the Americans did, in a way, in the minds of the perpetrators of terrorism, it is seen as an achievement. It's a victory. It's a withdrawal. The idea of radical Islamic terrorism still survives. And the reason the Americans left is because they are not willing to pay the price that goes along with fighting against this ideology. And this is the way it is interpreted by those who support the radical Islamic terrorism. And because of that, I think that I'm afraid that this move will be interpreted by these people as a victory, as something that encourages them to keep doing that. And we see already here and there some repercussions of that with all kinds of attacks, the one that we saw in Liverpool and others. And this is something that is that's worrying. We have to take this lesson into account. And it goes also to, you can take this lesson and employ it in the context of Iran. By not doing anything, by letting the Iranians move forward without any reaction, it's again adding up to this feeling that the West, as these radical Islamists think, is weak, is unable to protect itself, is not ready to pay the price that is required in order to win a war against radical Islamic terrorism. And that's something that, in my mind, is a problematic message. And we have to understand that this war is a very long war. This idea that okay, so this is the longest war, we have to put an end to it. The war is still waged, and it's not going to come to an end anytime soon. It's even ISIS, that we did have a victory against ISIS while we were able to deprive ISIS from its caliphate in Syria and Iraq, is still very active, both in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in many African states, and here and there also in Western Europe. So it's so this is something that we have to bear in mind and make sure that we are relevant to this war if we want to win it. And I think we do want to win it. We have to learn the lessons of what does it mean living. And we saw that unfortunately the Muslim partners, and there are many Muslims who are ready to participate in the war against radical Islamism, terrorism, radical Islamic terrorism. There are many Muslims that oppose it, fight against it. But unfortunately, we have to realize that our friends in this endeavor are relying on our immediate assistance. Yeah. As long as the Americans were there, they were able to fight, and they paid a heavy price, much heavier than the Americans did in this battle. They were committed to it, but they need a supporting hand next to them. Once they realize that the supporting hand disappears, is about to disappear, they lost their readiness to fight. So that's the message that we have to understand. It's there are many lessons that we have to learn for ourselves as Israelis. One of the major lessons is that since the Americans are ready to compromise on their superpower prowess and become less superpower, definitely in the Middle East, maybe even beyond that, we have to be much more capable to rely upon ourselves and be able to take care of our security by ourselves. Yep. And we also have to learn that all these stories we have been told about how we can rely on the support of all kinds of forces from within the more moderate elements in the Arab world for our security, we have to take this with a lot of grains of salt. Yep. And so it's not that easy for them. So this even more so tells us that we have to rely upon ourselves. I think that one of the things that our friends in the Arab world and the Muslim world can learn is how much they need somebody to replace the United States as a basis for support. And they on the one hand come to us because they know that we are there for them forever, and they don't have to worry about us leaving all of a sudden. But they also try, you see our Minister of Defense visiting Morocco, and the growing strengthening ties between us and the other members of the Abraham Accords countries like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And at the same time, what we see is that because the Americans are leaving, some of these countries are also learning their lessons and say, well, we cannot rely on the Americans. Maybe we should be in better terms with Iran itself and with Syria. And we see this warming up of the relations between Iran and the Gulf states, the Gulf states in Turkey, also a country that is dominated by radical Muslim leadership, not terroristic, but still radical Islamic. And we see that they are improving their relations with Assad in Syria. All of that is some sort of the lessons learned from the way the Americans left Afghanistan.
Yeah. We also need to talk about the Palestinians, and there was one Palestinian actor, at least, Hamas. They celebrated the Taliban victory in Afghanistan.
Of course, they are members of the same group of people in the Middle East, radical Islamic terrorist organizations that are less involved in international terrorism, but more involved in terror activities in their respective countries. Unfortunately, we have to suffer the terrorism of Hamas, while the Americans were suffering the terrorism of the Taliban. Yes, they definitely belong to the same group, and that's why they're so happy to see that Hamas, that Taliban has their success. And for Hamas, this is a message: yes, the invaders will disappear one day, and so on. They wrongly think that we and the Americans are of the same nature, but of course the truth is very different. We have to face the growing self-assurance of Hamas because of many reasons, amongst them what happened in Afghanistan. And we have to be on alert, and we are trying to reach some sort of an arrangement with Hamas that will mitigate their growing self-confidence. And I hope we shall be able to do that, but it's not clear, and we have to be prepared for any sort of wrong or misunderstanding of the Hamas of what they can achieve. And if they start another round of atrocities and the terrorism, we should be able to take severe measures against them. And I think we are preparing ourselves to such an eventuality, hoping to defer it as much as we can, because we have no interest in fighting them as long as they keep silent and calm.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, we are even trying more than they do to take care of the difficulties of their of the population that is living under them in Gaza. We are trying very hard to, together with Norway, by the way, to bring some assistance to the Palestinians in Gaza that will enable them to live a better life, and make sure that this assistance is not used by Hamas in order to rebuild its military capabilities.
Yeah, please give us a few examples of what Israel is doing that Hamas is not doing for the population of Gaza.
Yeah, well, we are trying very hard to make it possible for the people in Gaza to find work. We just opened the capabilities of the Palestinians living in Gaza to work in Israel, which little by little. It's very dangerous for the time being, but we open it. Today we're talking about something with about 7,000 people from Gaza that are allowed to enter Israel to work here. Or some of them are used under the terminology of merchants, but actually they work here. And this number can grow. We have opened the fishing area in the sea next to Gaza to 15 nautical miles, which is the longest, widest area that we can open it, while keeping track and making sure that it's not used. By the way, it is used for smuggling arms from Egypt. We have to allow money in. We just concluded an agreement with the Qataris and the Egyptians to let the Gazans get merchandise from Egypt entering Gaza and fuel. And we support them when we supply them cement. Again, something that is dual use and can be used by Hamas to reconstruct their tunnels. But we still allow them to get this and many other, almost all the commodities they need. And we are trying very hard to convince people to give them money in order to be able to rebuild whatever was hurt during the last operation. And we are those who actually are in a leadership position in trying to get this money. Of course, Hamas is not doing anything in this respect. And the Palestinian Authority is not able to intervene in what's happening in the Gaza Strip. So we are those who are leading the effort for the Palestinians to gain the resources they need in order to rebuild Gaza. We sincerely hope that this reconstruction will focus on civilian matters and will be used for improving the living conditions in Gaza. That's exactly what we want. Unfortunately, Hamas is committed to using much of these capabilities in order to rebuild their capabilities. We just heard from, we see every day the tests they do to the new weapons. And just this morning we had some operations, practice and tests they did in Gaza. But this is happening almost every day. And the leader of the Islamic Jihad has just said that they managed to reproduce everything they lost during the operation in May. So instead of using the resources in order to help the population, they use the resources in order to rebuild the capability to bring havoc again over to the same population in the future. Unbelievable, but this is the situation.
Tragic. So how do you see Hamas, the strength of Hamas in Judea and Samaria? Do you think, like, if the Palestinian Authority disintegrates even more, will Hamas be able to take power? Or
well, I think that we see the ongoing weakening of the Palestinian Authority in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. It's they are losing power by the day. They are trying to change the course of events a little bit. They had some operations in the last week in Jenin, in areas that they usually never enter, in the refugee camp and so on. But and we wish them luck. But we know how difficult it is for them, because they don't have the trust of the people anymore, and it's not easy for them. And what we see is that this void is being filled by a variety of groups. Hamas is one of them. They are trying to take advantage of the weakening of the Palestinian Authority and to strengthen themselves. So what they do is they have much more presence in the streets, and they allow themselves to take terror attacks. We just managed to foil a very big infrastructure of terrorists of Hamas in the West Bank. We arrested some 50 people that were involved in that they have already had the explosives enough for 3 to 4 explosive belts. You can imagine what could have happened if we didn't foil it on time. But that said, we cannot probably stop all the terror attacks, and we just had this week a terrible terror attack in Jerusalem by a Hamas activist who was allegedly, from the political wing of Hamas. He just took a weapon and started shooting in the street, killing an Israeli and injuring 3 others. So it's actually 4 others. And so this is the kind of threat that we have to live in. And definitely Hamas is trying to become more and more present in the streets. We saw that the demonstration that was held after this Hamas guy, Fadi Abu Shaidam, was killed during the terror attack. Big demonstration with Hamas flags moving in the Shuafat refugee camp. It's very clear that Hamas is gaining strength on the ground, but they are not the only people who are taking advantage of it. We see people who are loyal to other groups within Fatah that do not support Abu Mazen. They gain strength as well. So we see people from Dahlan's group, people from all kinds of factions within Fatah. There's a feeling that Abu Mazen is about to leave. Although I don't know how long he can stay. He's 86 years old, but he can stay forever. His father died at 101. So it's he has still time. But the assumption is that he's leaving. So everybody is now involved in this diadoc battles, improving their conditions to take over if something happens. We see a lot of tensions in those places that the Palestinian Authority cannot enter between all kinds of local factions that have some national affiliations, but actually they are local landlords. And we see tensions in Hebron between different clans in Hebron that turn into violent confrontations. It's not only disagreements that can be solved by going to the ballots. They actually shoot at each other. So the situation is very unstable and very volatile, and we have to bear that in mind when we look at the situation in the areas controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Yeah.
After a short break, we will be back with Yossi Kuperwasser, and we will ask him about Palestinian NGOs that Israel has designated as terrorist organizations, and we will also talk about Iranian activity in Europe.
Jag har fått frågan, varför övertalade du MIF Norge att starta MIF Sverige? Om vi i Sverige ska kunna bemöta den starkt ensidiga, förvrängda och demoniserande Israelbilden i många svenska media, så krävs det en snabb och effektiv, modern internetbaserad organisation som miff. Miff är ju en religiöst och partipolitiskt fristående organisation som genom flera årtionden i Norge bemött Israelfientlig propaganda med saklig information. MIFs rapporter från Israel och granskningar av bland annat den egna regeringen uppdateras på deras hemsida och på sociala medier flera gånger dagligen. Det är här vi effektivast når ungdomarna. För Israelvänner i Sverige blir allt äldre och för vi har inte lyckats nå unga svenskar där de är, på sociala medier och på internet. MIF har blivit respekterat och vuxit så kraftigt för de har använt effektiva kanaler för faktagrundad information om Israel. Något motsvarande har inte funnits i Sverige, men nu när MIFs arbetssätt för Israel är etablerat i Sverige finns alla förutsättningar för att bli lika framgångsrik som MIF Norge. En sak kan du hjälpa oss med. Bli medlem.
So we are back with Yossi Kuperwasser, and we talked about Hamas, but the Palestinian Authority itself and Fatah is not really preparing their population for peace and acceptance of Israel, to say the least. And several of the issues we work with in Israel, in Norway, is that they sponsor or they reward terrorists in Israeli prisons. And do you see a solution to that? Do you think that they will ever be willing to stop?
I don't know. They say that this is the last thing they're going to be ready to do. They are committed totally to paying salaries to the terrorists that are serving time in Israeli jails, and to the families of the terrorists that lost their lives during carrying out terror attacks or during fighting against Israel, and to the wounded people that those Palestinians who were wounded while they were carrying out terror attacks. It's a part of their narrative, you know. They strongly believe that Israel should not exist. But if it does, it should not be the nation state of the Jewish people. There is no Jewish people. There's no history of Jews, no sovereign history of Jews in this piece of land. That's why Israel shouldn't exist. And what the Palestinians should do is struggle against Israel until it disappears. And every kind of struggle is legitimate. And because of that, we are ready to pay salaries to those who participate in the struggle, because according to the Palestinian law, those people who carry out terror attacks are the fighting sector of the Palestinian society, and they should be appreciated and rewarded. And I think this is something terrible, because they actually sponsor terrorism, and it's mind-boggling how the international community allows them to do that and gives them the money that affords them with the capability to pay salaries to terrorists. I think the message should be very clear. If the message is going to be clear, they might change it. If the message coming from the United States, as it is, the United States has the Taylor Force law that says that they shouldn't pay the Palestinians anything and shouldn't give them any assistance as long as they keep paying salaries to terrorists. And if Europe will join in, Norway and Australia did join, and if more countries join in and say, we are not going to pay salaries to help the Palestinians pay salaries to terrorists, this makes no sense. We do not sponsor terrorism against Israelis and against Jews. And if everybody is going to send the same message to the Palestinians, I think they would change and will eventually do something about it. But they think that they can get away with murder. And look, even this guy that I mentioned before, the Hamas guy, they pay salaries to everybody, not only the people from Fatah. So even this Hamas guy that carried out the attack last week, his family is going to be rewarded very well for his participation and his contribution to the struggle against Zionism. And this is something that really, I mean, how can anybody accept that? So I think something has to be done about it. And if there is a concerted effort to convince the Palestinians that this is unacceptable, I think eventually they will give it up. Actually, the Americans have already managed to convince them that they should make some changes. But these are totally insufficient changes. These are only totally cosmetic changes, not real changes. They have to put an end to this habit of paying salaries to terrorists. And that's something that is extremely important. And this law that enables them to do that and that forces them to do that has to be abolished, and the payments themselves have to come to an end. And we take out of the money that we collect for them the amount that they use for paying salaries to terrorists. We should remember these are not minor amounts. It's about 7% of the budget. It's more than 1.2 billion shekels, which is like $350 million every year. This is a huge amount of money that are being paid to these terrorists, because they don't pay them only once they are in jail. And they pay them very handsomely. When this comes, in this respect, they have a lot of generosity at the expense of the donors. They pay very beautiful big salaries. But it's also when you're out of jail. If you spend in jail more than 5 years, you get a salary for the rest of your life, even after you are out of jail. So people know that this is the best way to make sure that you will have a nice salary for your entire life. This is soliciting for terror. And they say these people are carrying out these attacks on our behalf. This is Abu Mazen saying. So we are committed to them. And this is something that is really, as I say, mind-boggling. You cannot accept it. And we have to realize that the Palestinian Authority is definitely an entity that sponsors terrorism. And we have to put an end to that. I think it can be done if we all deliver to them the same message. You can't do that. But we are not yet there, especially because of the Europeans. Some of the Europeans are so careful and not doing anything that would irritate the Palestinians that they refrain from raising this matter with them. They do raise it, but in a manner that is not at all convincing. And I mean, nobody wants them to pay salaries to terrorists, but nobody at the same time, not enough people are at the same time telling them in a very clear way, you shouldn't do it. Otherwise, there's a payment, there's a penalty for doing that.
A few weeks ago, Israel designated 6 Palestinian NGOs as terrorist organizations. Maybe you can give us briefly the background of the move and why do you think it's important?
Well, I think it's important because unfortunately, the Palestinians realize that there is an opportunity here to get money for terrorism through camouflaging themselves, disguising themselves as non-governmental organizations that take care of sublime problems like the well-being of the Palestinians and the well-being of their farmers and legal issues and human rights and all these very nice goals that were cynically used by the Palestinians as a tool to get money from the Europeans and deliver it to the terror groups. And actually, those 6 organizations, together with another couple of organizations that the Palestinians have that were already designated as terror organizations beforehand, are groups, organizations that are part and parcel of the terror organization called the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a Marxist organization that is totally committed to carrying out terror attacks against Israelis, and they keep doing that. And actually, the reason why we did that, this move was possible, was that they carried a terror attack back in 2019 against a couple of Israelis that were bathing in a nice resort, in a nice place in the open area in the Samaria area. And they killed a girl named Rina Schnerb and wounded her father and her brother. And this was done by the Popular Front of the Liberation of Palestine. Once Israel started looking into this operation, they turned out that the infrastructure that was behind it was made of people who are members of these NGOs. And it wasn't that we didn't know that these NGOs are members or made of people that are members of the Palestinian, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. We knew that, but we didn't take at that time seriously enough the threat that they posed. Now that they were directly involved in terrorism, this caused an investigation into the matter. And then, during the investigation, we learned that it's not only that these people are members of the PFLP, it's called, but are using their NGOs as a source for paying salaries to the members of the PFLP and delivering funds for the PFLP by cheating on the Europeans and taking the money, issuing false fraud receipts for things that they bought for a small amount in order to get a lot of money from the European donors, and using this money, the difference between what it really cost them and what they received, in order to give money to the PFLP, especially as the Palestinian Authority at some points of time decided not to give money to the PFLP because there were all kinds of rifts between them, and because basically those who pay for those salaries is the Palestinian Authority. That's they deliver money to the PFLP on a regular basis, but this enabled the PFLP to get much more money. And all these organizations are part and parcel, as I said, from the PFLP. And if you look at the names of the people that fill the important positions in these organizations, you see that these are all members of the PFLP who hold key positions in the PFLP. And so it's a clear situation where it's only camouflage. It's only fake NGOs that are actually part of the PFLP, and that's what we did. And because of that, once realizing that this can be proven, we Israel designated this organization. By the way, if anybody wants to read a little bit about it, I personally wrote an article about it a year ago, well before this happened, in Tablet magazine. So if you look, Tablet magazine, Yossi Kuperwasser, one of the articles I wrote there in September 2020 was about that. And there are there's a lot of stuff all over the place. Well before this designation that indicated that these are PFLP organizations. All those people who wrote about it didn't have the kind of information that our security services managed to gain after they started the investigation into the real identity of these organizations after the killing of Rina Schnell, the murdering of Rina Schnell.
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that both Norwegian and Swedish and Danish money flow to
unfortunately they were
these organizations,
as well as Dutch money and the Belgian money. All these countries were involved in supporting these organizations without any due diligence into what they actually do, without any real auditing of their books. If they did, they could have seen that something is strange.
Regarding this agricultural workers organizations, they are using an old report from Australia to say that it's not connected to PFLP, which is it's ridiculous when you see all the other documentation.
But, first of all, there are several of the key officials are members of the PFLP. It's very strange.
So last question. We talked in the beginning about Iran, and even the Norwegian security police thinks that Iran intelligence activity is one of the greatest threats to Norway. They have been saying that for years. And talk a little bit to us about Iranian activity in Europe and what we should be aware of in that respect.
So first of all, I must say that so far the Iranian activity in Europe is not a regular terror activity like the one that you see coming from radical Sunni groups. Radical Sunni groups are ready to take terror attacks against Christians, against non-believers. They would do that in Europe just as they do it in the Middle East, and of course they rely on the local Muslim population to find within them some people who will carry out terror attacks, and we see it repeatedly in France and everywhere, Spain, whatever. The Iranians so far are more sophisticated. They worry that if they do that, this will cause tensions between them and the Europeans ahead of schedule. So they're not against tensions, but they want to make them on time, their time. And So they focus on two things. One is terror against their dissidents. That's the first target, and they do not. They're not vegetarians, which when it comes to that, they would carry out attacks in Europe against their dissidents without any inhibitions. And you saw recently the trial against them in Belgium, where one of their diplomats was put to trial because of its involvement. We saw it in the United States when they were trying to abduct Masih Alinejad, dissident, Iranian dissident from New York. They really have no limits when it comes to working against their dissidents. Be the price what it may be, and they believe that as long as they operate against the dissidents, they don't have to worry. The Europeans will show some understanding. Even if they take action, it's not going to be a decisive one. Definitely not sanctions against Iran or anything like that. In the worst case, the operative that is being caught is put to trial. Okay, and then in 2 years, they will abduct some European guy and say, okay, bring us this diplomat, and we shall release your guy, and this entire thing is going to come to an end. And unfortunately, they're quite correct in their understanding. So this is one sort of threat. The other sort of threat is that they are ready to put Israelis in danger as well. Not everywhere. They are cautious. There are places where they think that they can get away with this kind of activity, and places where they think it's more dangerous. So we saw them acting in Bulgaria. We saw them acting in Cyprus, other places. But they so far haven't seen them doing that in places like London. Okay, yeah. They have the certain policy, but they build the infrastructure and the capabilities that may be used in order to strike against Israelis, because maybe also against Americans. They haven't done it yet, but I wouldn't be totally surprised if they will take some action against Americans if they are attacked by the Americans. And so they build this capability. Against Israelis, they do it even without waiting for Israel to do something, because they feel threatened by the Israelis all the time. Israel, they consider it to be responsible for all kinds of cyber attacks in Iran and so forth. So while they're carrying out cyber attacks against Israel as well, and terror attacks, but they also want to be able to operate against Israeli targets in Europe. That is happening from time to time. I don't see them at this point trying to use their infrastructure in order to carry out terror attacks against the wider population. But of course, this cannot be acceptable by anybody. It's using your territory in order to take action against people of different nationality. It's still definitely diplomats, but sometimes not diplomats. It's tourists and so on. We saw that in Burgas in Bulgaria, where they carried out a terror attack against. And recently, just where some of them were arrested in Cyprus, trying to take action against Israeli businessmen. So it's something they keep working on, believing that they will be able to get away with this murder as well. And I think it's very important that the Europeans signal to them that no, you misinterpret our behavior. And I think this is very important. We are trying to work together with the Europeans when it comes to sharing information about such infrastructure. And I think we saw that, I don't know if this was a result of this cooperation, but I wouldn't rule it out. The fact that some of these operations were thwarted before they took place, like the one in Cyprus, is maybe a result of such cooperation. I won't be surprised. But even though we have very impressive intelligence about the Iranians, I cannot say that we are fully proofed against any such attack, and we have to be all the time on alert and take the necessary precautions to make sure that they are not successful.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Yossi. It was great. Thanks for your update and for sharing your time and your knowledge. And is there anything you want to say to friends of Israel in Scandinavia before we end?
Well, maybe just that be in touch.
Yeah.
Make sure that you take the information and the truth about what's happening in the Middle East from reliable sources, don't hesitate to ask. You have to find a way to ask, and we have a few sources. You can reach me, you can reach all kinds of NGOs in Israel that provide the information that is necessary for people who want to really know the truth about what's happening here. Very important, because there is a bombardment of fake news and misleading information about the Middle East. So be very careful in choosing your sources of information. Make sure that you rely on reliable and really good information. Good.
That's a good advice. And so happy Hanukkah to you and your family.
Thank you very much.
Litot. Bye-bye.
Hanukkah Sameach.
Vi håper du vil abonnere på Med Israel for fred på YouTube. Her finner du et stort antall foredrag av internasjonale eksperter, aktuelle direktesendinger og korte videoklipp. Husk å like, abonnere og motta varsler. MIFs YouTube-kanal vil gi deg noe alle trenger, mer forståelse for Israel.